This oak tree was planted in 1890 by Sir Henry Parkes, who is called the father of Federation. It was planted to mark the end of the first Australasian Federation Conference that had just finished here in Melbourne. It is called the Federal Oak because this conference gave the go-ahead for the drafting of a new constitution, not just for the colony of Victoria, but for the Commonwealth of Australia. As early as 1855, Charles Wentworth had talked about an association of the colonies, and this idea had been discussed in vague ways for decades. By 1890, the concept was being embraced by politicians who saw that the time was right to join the 6 colonies together into one nation. Even so, it was to take 10 years of meetings, public rallies and conferences to make Federation a reality.
As Henry Parkes and the other politicians posed for a photograph at the end of this conference, a lot of work had already taken place to sort out how 6 independent colonies that shared so much in common could work together within Australia. This opened the door for cooperation and dialogue between the colonies, and by 1890 agreements were in place that covered issues as diverse as quarantine, the postal service, immigration and defence. But some problems, such as customs and excise, proved to be harder to reform than most.
This is the Murray River, and it was the dividing line between 2 of the most populous colonies in Australia, the colony of Victoria on the far bank and the colony of New South Wales on this side. In 1883, a great celebration was held here when this bridge was opened. It's a rail bridge, and it joins the city of Albury in the north with the city of Wahgunyah in the south. And with its opening, a direct rail link between Sydney and Melbourne had been formed. While this bridge certainly made travel between the 2 cities a lot easier, the journey was still not without its delays.
Passengers making the rail journey between Sydney and Melbourne before Federation would have got off the train at Albury station, often in the middle of a freezing night. They did this for 2 reasons. The first was that the passengers had to have their luggage searched by customs inspectors at the border. As they were entering Victoria with its highly protected economy, import duty had to be paid on many of the goods that the passengers had in their possession. Secondly, and more fundamentally, they had to change trains because the width of the tracks was different between New South Wales and Victoria, making it impossible for one train to complete the whole journey. As his bags were searched and transferred from one train to the next, one passenger wrote in his diary that this was the strangest and most baffling marvel Australia has to offer, and that the division of Australia into these different and jealous colonies was a paralysis of intellect. Train travellers were certainly not the only people who felt this way, and the daily life of people in border towns such as Corowa and Wahgunyah, just to the west of Albury, gave numerous examples of why Australia should be federated.
This bridge over the River Murray was built in 1892, and it replaced an earlier wooden bridge that had been built by John Ford, the first squatter in this district. Ford had established his property here in 1838, and he called it the Wahgunyah Run. And because Victoria was not a separate colony at this point, his land stretched over both banks of the river.
By 1856, Ford had laid out the town of Wahgunyah on the south bank of the river, in what was then the very young colony of Victoria. Here he built a flour mill and public buildings as the town became a port for the paddle steamers that used the Murray. At the same time, what used to be Ford's land to the north of the river, in New South Wales, was laid out as the new settlement of Corowa. Both communities developed over the years to become regional centres, all the time separated by the Murray River but linked together by Ford's Bridge.
Even though the people of Wahgunyah and Corowa were literally only a stone's throw apart, they were citizens of separate colonies, and the problems of customs affected their everyday lives. Residents of Corowa at the time complained that when a man comes here from Victoria, he is treated like a foreigner, and when a woman goes to Wahgunyah, she is treated like a smuggler. This situation also cost the residents here a lot of money, even when it came to basics such as bread. Wheat, for example, would come from New South Wales through Corowa. As it crossed the bridge here, an import duty had to be paid to the Victorian government. After the wheat had been ground into flour at Ford's mill in Wahgunyah, it was brought back across the bridge to Corowa, where it was baked into bread. In turn, when this bread was taken back to Wahgunyah for sale, another import duty had to be paid, and at each stage the price went up. It is no wonder that the people of these border settlements became enthusiastic supporters of federation.
In cities such as Sydney and Melbourne, other issues also started to move people towards federation. One of their concerns was foreign affairs, as the French were taking over the Pacific islands of New Caledonia, and the Germans were on Australia's doorstep with their annexation of New Guinea. Yet there was no one Australian voice to coordinate foreign policy, and nor was there an Australian army or navy to oppose these threats. And although each colony had their own contingent of troops, many thought this piecemeal approach made Australia vulnerable to attack. Another concern was immigration, especially Asian immigration, and people began to see that only a national immigration policy could stop what people felt was the threat of Chinese and coloured people to Australian society. Mixed with this was also a growing sense of Australian nationalism, and in both the city and the bush, people began to talk of breaking the bonds with Britain to develop an independent Australian identity. This newfound pride in being an Australian was expressed with great energy and skill by the writers and artists of the day. In literature, poets like Henry Lawson glorified what it meant to be a free Australian, and painters such as Arthur Streeton and Tom Roberts discovered that Australian light and colour was something new and something to be cherished.
By the 1890s, these concerns had created a groundswell of interest to examine the possibilities for federation. And under the leadership of Sir Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, the federation movement began to pick up steam. It was decided that another convention be held in 1891, made up of men appointed from each colony. This convention was convened here, in the Parliament House of New South Wales, a building that had been constructed by Governor Macquarie as a hospital at a time when New South Wales was a very different place. At a banquet to mark the occasion, Sir Henry Parkes made the toast of "One people, one destiny." And in the weeks that the members met here, the basic form of Australia's future government began to take shape.
The Sydney Convention wanted a constitution to be drafted to set out their ideas on how the future federal government would operate. This document, that would come to be Australia's first national constitution, was inspired by a number of government systems from around the world. As their model for the important lower house of Parliament, the House of Representatives, the writers of the Australian Constitution looked to Britain. Inspired by the Westminster system, they made the lower house the most powerful, as it controlled things such as taxation, and one of its members was to lead the government as Prime Minister. This house would favour the large populous colonies, as they would have more representatives in the chamber because they had more voters. However, since all the colonies, even the smallest, had to agree to federation, the drafters of the Constitution corrected this imbalance of power by creating an upper house. The British model for an upper house, the House of Lords, was not seriously considered, and instead the writers looked to America, and they took the concept of the Senate to act as an upper house of Parliament that could review and delay any laws that the lower house proposed. To protect the smaller colonies, the writers of the Constitution made the Senate a States House, where each former colony would receive the same number of representatives regardless of its population. Because the Senate was a house of review that could at times reject legislation, it was seen as a guarantee to the smaller colonies that their concerns would not be lost to the power of Parliament's lower house. During the Easter break of the 1891 convention, the committee who'd been assigned to draft these aspects into a constitution spent several days motoring around Sydney Harbour. Aboard the Queensland Government launch the Lucinda, they tried to finish writing the constitution, although choppy seas meant that the committee members were seasick most of the time.
The Constitution had largely been developed before these men came aboard, mostly by Andrew Clark, a Tasmanian who was a great admirer of American democracy. But the drafting committee were able to incorporate recent discussions, and by the end of Easter 1891, a draft Australian Constitution was presented to the Convention. After 6 days' debate, the Convention approved the Constitution, and it seemed that federation was just around the corner.
As the Sydney Convention was disbanding, full of high hopes, the colonies were about to go into one of the severest economic recessions they had experienced. Almost overnight, property values in cities like Melbourne plummeted and unemployment rose. On the streets, industrial unrest grew as trade unions battled for their members' livelihood, and without bread on the table, people's attention drifted from the federation issue. As the economy soured, the spirit of cooperation between the colonies evaporated, and now that federation was no longer a dream, but a tangible thing with a written constitution, public scrutiny and criticism grew.
By the end of 1892, the issue of federation appeared to be, as it was said at the time, as dead as Julius Caesar. However, federation proved to be more resilient than that, and residents of border towns such as Corowa here kept the flame alive, as they saw federation as a way to freer trade and larger markets that would help haul the colonies out of their economic mess. Edmund Barton, one of the most tireless campaigners for federation, visited Corowa in December 1892, and he encouraged the local people to form their own federation leagues to help push the cause of federation along. Soon there were 15 of these leagues in the district, and since the new bridge had just been opened, it was decided that a federation conference be held at Corowa in July 1893. Over 70 delegates attended this conference, including the Victorian Premier, and on the night before it began, the whole group held a banquet on the second floor veranda, which was unfortunately removed in the 1950s, of Corowa's Globe Hotel. At the dinner here were many passionate supporters of federation, and as it would turn out, one of them had an idea on how to revive the federation movement.
The next day, as the conference met at Corowa's courthouse, it heard a resolution from John Quick, a Bendigo doctor who wanted a practical outcome to the conference. Quick suggested that the people of each colony elect representatives to attend a constitutional convention that would consider the best model of government. Once they had chosen a model, this would be presented to the people of each colony to vote on. If a majority of people said yes, then federation was to go ahead. Quick's resolution to the conference was accepted with acclaim, and work began to make sure that the people from each colony would now decide how federation was to proceed. At this border town that rightly calls itself the birthplace of federation, the issue at last had become a popular movement. Two years later, in 1896, Sir Henry Parkes, the father of Federation, died at his home in the Blue Mountains. And although the job of leading the Federation movement now passed to a new generation, Parkes would have known at the end of his life that public enthusiasm had been restored for his long-held dream to unite the colonies.
The rebirth of the Federation movement was very noticeable in a colony that had been proclaimed under this tree in 1836, the colony of South Australia. Like Victoria, this colony had begun with a commercial contract, but this time the British government was involved from the beginning, as South Australia was established as a model example of how to found a colony that was not a penal settlement. The first 30 years of European occupation saw great expansion as a series of good seasons allowed settlement across this normally very dry region. Under the leadership of William Light, the city of Adelaide was laid out on a grand scale, and its people, free from the convict stain, endeavoured to put in place many ideas of social reform.
Most important of these reforms was to give women the vote, an event that first occurred in an election in 1895, the first instance of women voting in Australia, and among the first in the world. Not long afterwards, the Federation movement gave the opportunity for another milestone to be reached in South Australia. In line with John Quick's proposal several years before in Corowa, the South Australian government decided to hold a ballot in March 1897 to elect delegates to the Constitutional Convention that would soon be held in Adelaide. As this convention would decide the best model for Australia's new federal government, the elections generated a fair amount of interest. One of those to put their name forward as a possible delegate was Catherine Spence, a journalist, writer, preacher, and tireless campaigner for electoral reform and women's rights. And, by being involved in this election, she became the first woman in the British Empire to run for political office. Catherine Spence, along with many other women, spoke in favour of federation, as they saw it as a way to secure the right for women to vote in all colonies. And when women had the vote, they reasoned, politicians would finally have to consider women's views on all issues. In the election, Spence polled over 7,000 votes and came 22nd out of a field of 33, not enough to qualify as a delegate to the convention, but it was a pioneering event that helped make sure that all citizens, both men and women, would have the right to vote in a federated Australia.
At the end of March 1897, 40 men, this time elected by the people of their respective colonies, gathered here in Parliament House, Adelaide, to attend the National Australasian Convention, or as we would call it, the People's Convention. All colonies were represented here, apart from Queensland, which did not want to take part, and under the leadership of Edmund Barton, this convention sat for 5 weeks, revising the constitution that had been drawn up in 1891. A lot of the debate here centred around what powers the Senate should have, and in particular, whether it should be strengthened by giving it control over the supply of money to the lower house. Many of the delegates here, however, argued that this would make the new federal parliament unworkable, and they urged that the Senate remain as a house of review that could not alter these so-called money bills. After frantic late-night meetings, the dangers of having an upper house that was too powerful became more evident, even to the delegates from the smaller colonies, and this convention approved a constitution that limited the powers of the Senate along the lines of the original 1891 constitution.
Following this agreement, a referendum was held in each colony during June 1898 to determine if the people wanted to accept the constitution as it stood and join the Federation. All the conventions, meetings and effort by so many people had now come down to a simple yes or no. Yes for a federated Australia, or no to keep the colonies in place. As the colonies swung into election mode, it was clear that many people feared that their particular colony would lose its independence as part of a federated Australia. If they were from New South Wales with its large population and robust economy, people were worried that they would be financially supporting the smaller colonies and giving over hard-earned gains. While people in South Australia, with a small population, thought that their colony would be dominated in the new federal government by representatives from other colonies. But the groundswell of support for the obvious benefits of federation won the day, and each colony that took part in the referendum had a majority of people voting yes. There were, however, problems. Two colonies that covered more than half the continent, Queensland and Western Australia, had not participated, and in New South Wales a straight majority was not enough, as a local law required 80,000 yes votes in order for the colony to join the Federation. As this required number was not reached, New South Wales could not proceed, and without New South Wales there could be no meaningful federation.
In order to break this deadlock, George Reid, the Premier of New South Wales, called a Premiers' Conference to be held in Melbourne behind closed doors. Here the Premiers made slight alterations to the Constitution, and they included a clause that the new capital of a federated Australia would be in New South Wales, but it had to be more than 100 miles from Sydney. This last point was seen by Premier Reid as important if the voters of New South Wales were to support federation and not feel that they were losing power and prosperity to a smaller neighbour. With these revisions in place, the people of the colonies, this time joined by Queensland, but still without Western Australia, voted in another referendum in the middle of 1899. Again, the yes vote was in the majority in all colonies, and importantly, over 100,000 people voted yes in New South Wales, passing the required 80,000 votes and thereby allowing New South Wales to join the Federation. Even without Western Australia, Federation could now proceed.
One final hurdle, however, remained. Although the people of Australia had agreed to the new constitution, the colonies still had to get the approval of the British Parliament for federation to proceed. In March 1900, an Australian delegation that included Edmund Barton, Alfred Deakin and Charles Kingston travelled to London to lobby the British politicians. The British were very impressed with the arguments set forth by the Australians, and they agreed to support the new constitution, on the one condition that Britain should have some legal powers over the High Court of Australia, just in case its interests were at stake. This was a sore point with the Australian delegation, as the writers of the Constitution had expressly created the High Court to make Australia self-reliant from Britain, and they had given the High Court full and final powers over the interpretation of the Constitution. The Australian delegation therefore insisted to the British that only Australians could judge Australia's laws, and they forced the British to back down and be content with only minor changes. The prospect of federation became a reality when on the 9th of July 1900, Queen Victoria added her signature to the legislation. This allowed the colonies to become the Commonwealth of Australia on the first day of 1901. With royal approval making federation a certainty, pressure was brought to bear on Western Australia to join as an original member. The arguments set forth were convincing, and in July 1900 the people of Western Australia voted to join in. Now all colonies had agreed to federate, and plans were set in motion for a grand celebration of nationhood on the very first day of the 20th century.
This is Centennial Park in the middle of Sydney. Before Europeans arrived in Australia, this was an area of freshwater springs and marshy land that provided the local Aborigines with some of the food and particularly the water they needed to survive in this region. The ponds that dot the park today are all that survive of this ancient environment, but even so, it still serves the needs of the local community, this time for picnics and bike riding. As people enjoy the park today, very few would stop and have a look at this building here that looks like a cross between a Greek temple and a bandstand. But it marks a very important location because over there, the nation of Australia came into being on the 1st of January 1901.
In a temporary structure, now marked by the newer monument, the first Governor-General of a federated Australia, Lord Hopetoun, was sworn in and the new constitution came into force. Watching the ceremony were thousands of people, and across Australia parades and street parties celebrated the end of the long road to federation. While there was a lot to be proud of in the new constitution, most notably that all women in Australia would now have the vote, there was a downside, as the Constitution did not even recognise Aboriginal Australians, declaring them to be non-citizens and therefore unable to vote or run for political office. Although it had its faults, some of which would take years to rectify, the 1901 Constitution now had to lay the foundations for a fully functioning federal government. The first steps in this process came in March 1901, when elections to the new federal parliament were held, and on the 9th of May, the Duke of York opened the first sitting of this new parliament, as it gathered in Melbourne's exhibition building. At its head, as the Commonwealth of Australia's first Prime Minister, was Edmund Barton, a man who had been at the front of the federation movement for more than a decade.
While federal parliament and the constitution were in place, it would still take several years before Australia had a national capital that would govern for all Australians. The first step came when part of a sheep station along the Molonglo River was chosen to be the site of Canberra, the nation's new capital. True to the constitution, this area was in New South Wales, but more than 100 miles from Sydney. Federal Parliament was transferred from Melbourne to Canberra in 1927, even though Canberra hardly existed as a town at the time. In this building, now known as Old Parliament House, the government of the day put federation into practice, as it still does, in a new and larger Parliament House that has since been built on Capitol Hill. The government structure of Canberra was only completed in 1980 when the High Court moved here and began to hear cases in this building. 90 years after it had been first conceived by the writers of the Constitution, a capital for a federated Australia had become a concrete reality. It had been a long road to reach this point. What had begun as a penal colony for the discards of Britain was now a nation with a strong sense of democracy. This did not happen overnight or by accident, but was the result of a lot of effort over a long time. Whether it was Charles Wentworth pushing to give ex-convicts some say in their own country, the oratory of Peter Lalor at the Eureka Stockade, or the struggles of Ned Kelly, all of these factors moulded the Australian character, a character that valued the basic rights of a true democracy. This character was picked up during the 1890s by politicians as well as ordinary men and women, and incorporated into a unique system of government that was defined by a unique constitution. To this day, the Constitution remains the cornerstone of our nation. It is an Australian constitution for Australian conditions, and as Henry Parkes said a long time ago in Sydney, it governs one people who have one destiny.
Give yourself a chance to taste the kind of fun only Ned Kelly can put on. Oh, dance, can roll and dance without a second glance at anything tomorrow may have hid behind the sun.